All right, let's jump right in. When we talk about the huge conflicts of the 20th century, the Korean War often gets called the Forgotten War. But trust me, it was anything but forgettable. This was a really brutal war that not only tore a nation apart, but also kicked off a massive wave of fear and paranoia right here at home in America, totally reshaping our politics for decades.
And here's the wild part, the thing that makes it so relevant even now. The actual fighting stopped way back in 1953, but a real, official peace treaty? Nope, never signed. So how is that possible? How is a conflict from the very dawn of the Cold War technically still going on today? Let's break it all down.
So, to really get it, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the global tensions that lit the fuse for the war, then we'll walk through the fighting itself and see how that fueled a full-blown panic back in the States. And then we'll zoom out to look at the, well, terrifying strategies of the bigger Cold War. Think of this as your go-to study guide for a super pivotal moment in history.
Okay, first things first, we've got to set the scene. World War II had just ended, but things were anything but peaceful. Instead, the whole world was basically splitting into two teams. You had the United States and its allies on one side, and the Soviet Union and the spread of communism on the other. What's just staggering here is how fast everything happened. I mean, look at this. In 1945, Korea is split in two. Just 4 years later, China, the most populous country in the world, falls to communism. That same year, the Soviets test their first atomic bomb, which completely ends the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons. For American leaders, it just looked like a line of dominoes, one tipping right into the next, leading straight to North Korea's invasion of the South in June of 1950. So this dividing line is absolutely crucial, the 38th parallel. After World War II, the US and the Soviets agreed to just temporarily split Korea to manage the transition from Japanese rule. But what started as a simple line on a map, just an administrative boundary, very quickly hardened into a real political border. It became the flashpoint between a communist North backed by the Soviets and a US-supported South. Now, having just lost China to communism, President Truman was absolutely determined not to let South Korea fall too, so he committed US troops. But, and this is a huge deal, he did it under a United Nations resolution calling it a police action. What that meant was he never actually asked Congress for an official declaration of war. That move set a really powerful precedent for how presidents would use military force for decades, especially in places like Vietnam. The war itself was this incredibly brutal seesaw. At first, the North Koreans just stormed south and nearly took the whole peninsula. Then, General Douglas MacArthur pulls off this brilliant but super risky landing at Incheon that completely flips the script, pushing the North Koreans all the way back to the Chinese border. Well, that poked the bear. China jumped in with hundreds of thousands of troops, shoving the UN forces all the way back down south. By 1951, the war had ground to a halt in this bloody stalemate, right back where it all began. For the United States, the human cost was just enormous. More than 33,000 American service members died in just 3 years of fighting. And for what? For a war that ended in a tie? But that number, as high as it is, just pales in comparison to the total devastation. It's estimated that around 3 million Koreans and Chinese were killed, and the vast, vast majority of them were civilians, just caught in the middle of it all. It was an absolutely catastrophic loss of life. And this is where we get to the war's really strange ending. The 1953 ceasefire stopped the shooting and created the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. It's this heavily guarded strip of no man's land that's still the border today. But here's the key. A ceasefire is just a pause, it's not a peace treaty. And that is why, officially, the Korean War never really ended. Now, this whole conflict wasn't just being fought in Korea. Back here in the US, while soldiers were fighting communism overseas, a whole different kind of battle was raging. A huge wave of anti-communist paranoia, what we call the Second Red Scare, was sweeping across the country. This wasn't a war with guns, it was a war of accusations, suspicion, and fear. And right at the heart of all this was Senator Joseph McCarthy. He famously claimed he had a list of known communists working inside the State Department, a list, by the way, that he never actually produced. His name gave us the term McCarthyism, which is basically this political tactic of just making reckless, totally unproven accusations of treason to ruin people's reputations and scare everyone else into silence. And believe me, this fear had very real consequences. You had the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HWAC, holding these huge, televised hearings to root out communists. In Hollywood, studios created blacklists that completely destroyed the careers of writers and actors. High-ranking officials like Alger Hiss were put on trial for spying. And in the most chilling case of all, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were actually executed for selling atomic secrets. The fear was absolutely everywhere. This intense fear on the home front was perfectly mirrored by an equally intense strategy on the world stage. Now that both the US and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, the old rules of war were just out the window. A new and frankly terrifying kind of logic started to take over. Okay, so for your study guide, you have got to understand these two key ideas. First, you have brinkmanship. This was an active strategy mostly used by President Eisenhower's administration. The idea was to push a crisis right to the very edge, the brink of nuclear war. Basically to play a game of chicken and force the other guy to back down first. Now, all of this was happening under the shadow of a much darker idea, mutual assured destruction, or MAD. And MAD wasn't a strategy to win a war, it was a doctrine to prevent one. The logic was simple and grim. If you launch your nukes at us, we will launch ours at you, and both of us will be completely wiped off the face of the earth. No one wins. So let's put a few of these big Cold War moments on a timeline, just so you can see how things kept escalating, way beyond what was happening in Korea. You can see the progression so clearly here. Even while the fighting is still raging in Korea, the bigger Cold War is heating up. After the ceasefire in '53, the arms race just explodes. The US gets the H-bomb, and by 1955, so do the Soviets. Then the whole competition leaps into a new frontier. In 1957, the Soviets shock the entire world by launching Sputnik 1, the first satellite. That kicks off the space race, and the US responds by creating NASA just 1 year later. Whew. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground, from a battlefield in Asia all the way to a hearing room in Washington, D.C. So let's do a really quick rapid-fire review of the key terms you absolutely need to know. Okay, remember, the 38th parallel, that was the line on a map that became a real hardened Cold War border. McCarthyism was that fear of communism turned into a political weapon at home. Brinkmanship was that high-stakes, dangerous game of nuclear chicken. And it was all supposedly held in check by MAD, mutual assured destruction, that terrifying idea that a nuclear war was simply unwinnable. And that leaves us with one last, kind of chilling question to think about. If MAD was the ultimate safety net, right? The thing designed to prevent nuclear war through the fear of total annihilation, but brinkmanship was a strategy that required constantly risking that very annihilation to get your way. Well, did that dangerous game actually keep the peace? Or did it just give us more chances to slip and fall into the abyss?